What if the skills that actually determine how far you go in your career isn't IQ, but EQ? Today on Unbarred Conversations, I'm sitting down with Ismail Qadry, tech leader turned emotional intelligence coach and emotional intelligence co-host who built his success on building trust, regulating emotions under pressure, and creating high-performance teams. We cut through the fluff on why emotional intelligence is a fundamental skill, not a soft one, how to build self-awareness and navigate conflict, and why most post-secondary programs are failing to teach it. If you're a business student or a young professional who wants honest feedback on communications, teamwork, and the real mad skills that matter, this conversation's for you. Let's get into it.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really honored and excited to have this conversation with you. So like my emotional intelligence journey has been, I think, an interesting one in the sense that it's one of these innate threads that I think I have within myself, but didn't really realize it was a skill until much later on in my career. And so my background is more technology and business. So I have a business degree, but later on, probably about 10 years ago now, I started realizing that my success came from how I built and ran teams. I may not have been like the smartest person in the room, but what I could do the best is communicate, build strong teams. And so from there, I've been around the world working for consulting companies and focused on technology. But always what came through was my ability to build these relationships with team members and trust and loyalty. And that's kind of where this concept of emotional intelligence came in. When I saw what is emotional intelligence, I'm like, wait a minute, I do that all the time. That's me. And how I started really diving deeper into it. And as you mentioned, I started a podcast on it, and I've started my own leadership consulting company around emotional intelligence.
That sounds good. So I guess maybe let's just start with like, what is emotional intelligence? And I think more importantly, why is it important?
So a lot of people, I think emotional intelligence has a bad rap because it's got the word emotional in it. But I think one thing that I really want to impart upon people is that it is by no means a soft skill or a nice to have skill. It is really something that I think is almost just a mandatory foundational thing to have. So I consider emotional intelligence a foundational skill. And if we want to talk about like textbook definition of it, it's really your ability to recognize and understand emotions, and then your skill at using awareness to manage yourself and then your relationship with others. That is kind of how my textbook definition is. And then if we want to kind of dumb it down or simplify it, it's, can you understand what emotions you're feeling and how do you manage your emotions and your relationship with emotions of others?
With that, the whole idea is where do we go and why do you see this as really important? And again, I think we both agree on this in terms of it's an important thing. I put a lot of my coaching successes, and I've got a fairly incredible coaching record with Case Team, down to this whole thing that, yeah, I was able to put teams together that were able to function. And I think later on in my career, I realized that emotional intelligence was connected to that. But maybe get your insights into that piece of it in terms of why is this such an important piece in terms of putting or getting a team to actually perform together and getting into that area of higher performance.
For sure. So, I mean, I consider, if we think that, IQ, so your intelligence quotient, if it gets you through an exam or it gets you in the door for an interview, EQ would determine how far you go once you have gotten that exam or gotten that job. Right. And why is it important is that like there's a lot of people who can answer hard, concrete questions, like, what is a derivative, or how do you solve this concrete problem? But one thing that people really lack, and I've seen it firsthand, is, are they really able to regulate themselves in stressful situations? The minute there's a layer of stress that hits, I'm noticing a lot of people, they kind of crumble, or they go and they retract, they go back to like their primitive self, which is very reactionary. And I think it's tough to have any type of conversation with someone that is in that mode, and no fault of their own. I think it's a very natural, primitive approach where you kind of just scale back and try and protect yourself. But that doesn't move you forward in any situation, in a conversation, in a case, in a debate, when you're trying to convince people or in people. That does not work. It's the ability to open up and have conversations and build that relationship with people that is key.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. I've had teams, and I can think of one particular, an NBA team that just didn't get along that way in terms of each of them, or at least one or two members of the team would take that reactant type of approach in terms of if they didn't get their way type of thing. And I always talk about this when I talk about, and I think NBA teams were the most challenging to coach because his ego walks into the room with them. And yeah, oh, you've got some,
I
yeah.
was going to say, I think ego and pride are the number one killer for anyone's career and success in general. And I think that, people have, for some reason, they have this need or desire to be number one or to be the best or to win, and they think that it's an individual contribution, and by imparting upon or forcing their opinion, they think it's collaborative, they think it's the best idea, and it very well may be, it might be, but unless you can get everyone on board and rowing in the same direction, doesn't matter whether it's the best idea or not.
I know with the MBAs, it was always, I would go in, I think the first practice, or even when they were trying out for the team, this whole idea that I don't want people to keep score, because I think that really hinders it, especially when in this case solving situation. You're going to choose someone's solution, and that person that feels that they need to be picked every time, or at least be picked the same number of times. And when you're doing, I think one of the years we did 40 cases with our John Molson's team, right? And when you're doing that, becomes such a problem in terms of just getting them to think about what are they trying to accomplish here? What are they trying to accomplish in terms of the solution? And I think maybe this goes back to where the education system is. And I think I pick on post secondary, and I've been fairly critical at times, especially talking with a lot of my colleagues. But when you look at the skill sets, and emotional intelligence is one of those. I think there's a lot of people, I sit in meetings and say, you can't teach that, right? We do a lot of entrepreneurial programs at the University of Calgary, and we got people telling us you can't teach entrepreneurship. Maybe you can't teach entrepreneurship per se, but you can teach a lot of the skills that go into that. And maybe just talk about this whole idea that, yeah, emotional intelligence is something you can teach, or you can teach the skill set that goes along with that, because I'm a true believer in that. I know you're a very true.
Yes. So hands down, just to reiterate, emotional intelligence and research backs this is a teachable skill. So you're not like EQ. EQ, you're born with it. You're kind of, it's established at a very young age. But EQ, you can have zero EQ and learn it later on. And I'm going to say, let's give some of the post secondary a little bit of credit, and we'll say that they may teach some of the skills here and there, but what they don't do is they don't force the students to put in the reps, meaning practice it. You have to practice it. Just like any other skill, you have to practice it. So you can say, hey, communication is important. It's important that you listen as much as you talk. Like, these are very simple things, right? But if you don't give the students an opportunity to practice that, what do you expect? They're going to come out of there. They're going to know how to do a math problem, but they won't know how to communicate the value behind said concrete skill. And there's also no feedback. So I'm assuming when you're doing the cases and they're practicing, you're giving feedback to them, and hopefully they're open to that feedback and they're taking it in, right? Ideally, a successful group will take feedback. They know how to take constructive feedback. I find there's no reflection on that particular feedback and allowing someone to process, giving them the space to process that feedback. And then also another thing is, I'm not sure and you might be able to attest to this more than I can now, is are the teachers modeling that emotional intelligence as they're teaching? Right? I mean, people like even in your 20s, your brain is pretty much formed by that point, and but your personality is formed by that point. But now is the time to be able to really put in the reps to execute and practice those emotional intelligence skills. And what better way of doing that by seeing someone in front of you doing it?
Yeah, no, and I think the feedback piece is really important. It doesn't happen in a lot of cases, and there's been a really big discussion, I think, in post-secondary around the role of reflection, even. And I don't know if I started it when you were still a student, but I know in pretty well every senior class I did, I had this reflective blog. Nowadays, it was a journal in early days. The blog worked so much better because it was immediate and I could see it. You reflect, I can reflect back on your reflections type of thing. And those types of things don't happen in the classroom. Often it's a survey halfway through a course in terms of what's working for you, what's not working for you type of idea. And I found the blog, I'm getting those within, it doesn't happen in the first week, but a bunch of them start to show up in the second and third week. And I can react right away. You know what? That didn't work in this class. I can go back and maybe fix that if I take a little bit different approach to it. Or one excellent one is I've got this tool that I've developed with the help of a whole bunch of coaches around the world in terms of just getting feedback from them, et cetera. I took a tool that a couple of Haskell profs had kind of put together and just did a bit of active listening. And one of the students suggested that, you know what, the format wasn't quite right. And I'm now working with that student in terms of here's kind of what I think you suggested. Is it working? And he's made some more suggestion. And that doesn't happen. And it definitely, I don't think, really happens a lot in terms of the emotional intelligence piece of it when there's not that modeling, right? There's not that response. And part of it is, yeah, it's getting busy because of all the demands on a university instructor, especially at the teaching. There's a lot more demand for research nowadays or that service piece of it. And so I think those interfere with it. But if you were sitting down in front of a classroom, what kind of things would you suggest or do in terms of how do we start to deliver some of the skill set to our students and figure out if they're kind of figuring out? Because that part will actually help me too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of there's four competencies within emotional intelligence. And so there's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. Okay. And the foundational competency of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. That's the number. If you don't have self-awareness, pretty much all of the other competencies are moot, right? And so you talked about journaling or you talked about this blog, and it's I think it's really important to start with self observation or self reflection, teaching the students on how to be able to identify what they're thinking, what they're feeling. And again, I know the word feelings, they get a bad rap, but if you're feeling frustrated, there's so many bad things like that can snowball, and pretty much they lead you down the path of failure, right? Or not ideal situation. Whereas if you're feeling frustrated and you can name that particular feeling, I'm feeling frustrated, the minute you're able to name it, you can start to process it and start to address it. And from there, it's like, okay, well, identifying why you were triggered, what caused that frustration, and understanding how you automatically respond to those situations, right? So what needs to happen is there a method or approach of teaching self-regulation, self-observation in class? So once you're able, if you took 30 minutes to explain or even 5 minutes just to have this conversation with the students, but then immediately putting it into real time practice. So you're actually putting a student in a facilitator role, another student in an analytical role, and a group, and you're giving them instructions on the outcome that they need to get to somehow, but not how they're going to get there. They're going to start practicing these skills, right? And it's almost like having mock, like, these mock studies, these mock cases, and you're giving them a problem to solve. And along the way, you're teaching them the skills to do it, right? And it's a muscle. At the end of the day, each of these competencies are different muscles in your brain, and you need to work them out. And so we talked about like what it is, some avenues on how they should do it, but then also controlled exposure. So it's almost like, in therapy, if you are afraid of spiders, sometimes exposure therapy can help with that. So can you put them in a situation like a low stakes debate? Or, we don't want to get, politics, for instance, can really get people riled up. So maybe that's not a low stakes debate, but something along those lines, that it's like Pepsi or Coke, that kind of argument. Or what's worse, high fat, high sugar, these kind of simulations to get people picking a side. And it's not about winning or losing the argument. It's really about how are they able to, first of all, present themselves, but go back and reflect on what were you feeling as you were having that conversation. Can you identify the emotions or feelings or reactions that you had during that conversation? And if you're able to teach that, and to me, I thought I made these assumptions that this was just a given skill. Everyone has this skill that they're able to identify what they're feeling. And I was so wrong with that. And if you're able to at least start there with students, even with teachers, like teachers amongst teachers, right? Having these skill sets, I think there's a huge opportunity in post-secondary education, all educators, but we're talking about post-secondary here. And then of course that feedback, we talked about feedback, the feedback loop to everything that you just went through, whatever exercise you went through, being able to play that back to them and having them practice that back into, or roll that back into the next step.
Yeah, I think that's really cool because if I look at the process I had as a coach, I think a lot of that lines up exactly in terms of this is the process that we were going through in terms of it. And it was always strange, I think. Maybe that's not the correct word, but it was kind of strange initially when we got to our debrief sessions in terms of I would ask, how did you feel?
Right.
Right, and I saw that as they went along, they got a lot more aware and they were actually a lot more comfortable saying, you know what, I was frustrated by this piece or I was frustrated by that person. And part of that was that relationship. They had started to build a relationship where they could be honest with each other in terms of, yeah, you screwed up this time or whatever. Right. And sometimes it got fairly heated in the room in terms of, and then it was that skill of, so how do we take that down? But one of the things, and it just popped into my head as you're talking about that, and I'm pretty sure you probably experienced this as a student. What happens is, yeah, in September or fall term, they put a group together, right? And they're supposed to be working on this project through the whole term. And then come this week or last week of November, next week, the first week of December, when the term's up, you start to hear about, you know what, this person's doing nothing. Like, it's like, what do you expect me to do about it now? Right? And that's a lot of where my frustration came. But I think may put what I've been thinking is this target on a lot of post-secondary education when we do teamwork, right? It's let's start out and typically, and in the past, I don't know what people are doing nowadays, but typically it's let's put this contract together at the beginning of how we're going to work together. We'll sign it. I wonder if students ever read it, right? Well, what they sign.
I mean, it's really interesting that you use the term contract, or you use the notion of like this person isn't doing anything, is because right now, and back when I was a student, and even this translates into the workplace as well. There's always going to be someone who, for whatever reason, without judgment, isn't able to or doesn't want to pull their weight. It could be a myriad of reasons, and that's a whole conversation that's a topic for a different conversation. But right now, group work, all it becomes right now, I feel like, is you divide some tasks, finish your slides, and you hope that everyone does their part. That's what I feel like group work was and still is. And instead, why are we not teaching them this self-awareness? Why are we not teaching people empathy, compassion, conflict, and I'm not talking about resolution, I'm talking about navigation, conflict navigation, because resolving a conflict is I'm going to say binary, right? It's either fixed or not. Are you going to do your work? Yes. Are you not going to do your work? No. All right, we're going to get you out of the group, right? But how do you navigate that conversation to even start with saying, hey, I feel like you're not pulling your weight? Do you know? Like, I don't know. Even I still struggle to this day. Each situation is very unique. How do you broach the subject of performance and effort? And you have to be really comfortable and confident to be able to say it and to be able to take it, right? And having practice doing that, like putting people, forcing students. Can you imagine if there was like a lab where you had to critique someone and you had to come up with a real life example of something that didn't work in the group? I would probably be really scared of that. And then, back then, now, you know what? Let's do it. Let's have this conversation.
I love that. I think I've told this on another podcast, but I had a team in Budapest, probably one of the best teams I ever had in terms of talent. They got along. They actually became friends as they went through this process. But they went to their first case. We all knew as they walked into the room that they had just finished 4 out of 4. I had seen all 4 presentations, so I really knew it. They hadn't seen the other 3 presentations because I think they were the last group presenting, and they knew it. That what they had just done was incredibly bad. And we were really no one was surprised when we got 4th place out of 4 spots in our pool that afternoon. But what was really, really cool was we went for dinner. And so we were maybe 15-minute walk from the Danube. We were having dinner on a dock boat on the Danube River, which was kind of cool. But it must have taken us 45 minutes at least to get there. Everybody was wondering where Calgary was because we were awfully slow and they couldn't start the dinner until we got there. We did get lost a little bit, but that didn't take much time to get our bearings back. But it was just this wonderful conversation. And I guess the emotion was embarrassment, but it was just this wonderful conversation about what went wrong and where did it go wrong. And what they wound up deciding was they changed their process at the beginning. They didn't do what they had typically been doing as their process because this happened in the room when they were discussing the solution. And then to help that, the next day was a cultural day. And so we were on a bus for 14 hours visiting different cultural spots in central Hungary. And they all gathered in seats close to one another. And it was just incredible in terms of closeness that was starting to develop as they talked through a whole bunch of stuff. And that really great team of case solving skill turned into an actual team that I think could do anything they ever wanted to. And then when we did the last case, and it was a 2 case competition, it was fantastic. They did a spectacular job with it. And sort of that has become kind of a highlight of my coaching career in terms of this really happened and it can happen. Right. And I think it was just having that type of conversation. And when it comes down to the classroom, a lot of instructors are fearful of having those types of conversations. And I know you do this on a professional basis. You just talked about going into a classroom earlier this week.
Yes,
How
that's
do
right.
you, or I guess, what's the advice in terms of that person standing up front in terms of getting them to be comfortable with having that conversation? And I think practice is a big part of it. I know as a coach, I was really bad at the start doing this. And as I went along, I think I got better and learned how to do it. But maybe just get some of your advice on that piece of it.
I mean, I think it's important to have to know, like, there's an intention part of it, right? I mean, for the most part, we'll just say, unless you're a sociopath, you are not trying to hurt someone, right? And so it's not personal. I mean, the minute that you personalize it, and there's, I guess, 2 ways to look at it. One is you hope that people you're speaking to aren't taking it personal, and from you as a speaker, we'll say, so you trying to have a difficult conversation, that it isn't personal, it's for the greater good, right? And honesty is sometimes really difficult. One of the things about, like, this is where relationship management comes into play. Actually, it's a combination of social awareness and relationship management, right? So as you're talking to someone, can you read the room? So we'll talk about it from the perspective of me as a team member having to have a difficult conversation with my team about performance. And if I'm able to read the room and know, okay, they look open to this conversation, then you can go down a certain path. At the same time, you need to know people aren't ready for this conversation. It's for another time. So that's number one. I think timing is important, right? But also being able to have this relationship that, or knowing that there's been a relationship built on trust, and that what I'm trying to do is helpful. And leading with that is important. Just saying it, just calling it out, saying that this is not personal. This is more about the greater good. We all know that we've made mistakes and challenges. We have challenges, we've made mistakes. And the truth of the matter is really, really important. And I think also knowing that, reiterating what the common goal is. So if our goal is to have the best presentation, or to win, or to come out of here better, stronger people, if you're able to label that and talk about what the challenges are didn't lead to that and what we need to do to lead to that, I think that helps a lot with delivering that message. It softens it, so to speak, right? And EQ, just so you know, EQ is not about being nice. A lot of people think like, oh, you have to be nice. No, 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 no. EQ is about being effective. Can I get to a positive outcome? And sometimes that is having to rip off the band-aid and tell the truth, no matter how much it hurts or how difficult it is. But how you say it is important, along with what you say. But that, we were talking about this earlier before we started recording, is like tone alignment, right? But I think it's really important that you are honest. And sometimes that is a difficult conversation.
I would totally agree with that. I really like that idea of effectiveness because I
Yes.
think one of the things, and I think it's a, I had a co-coach, and you would have known Larry Wood at Haskane. We coached an NBA team together, and it was always like none. There was this whole idea that in feedback, you give positive feedback, then you give the negative feedback, and then you give the positive. That sandwich type of effect. And there was this whole thing in terms of Larry would come out and tell the teams initially that Cam and I can't serve sandwiches. We have trouble. We have serving open face sandwiches at that, right?
Right.
And I think that's a key part of it too, is just as you're setting this up, is having agreement in terms of what to be expected a little bit in terms of it. And I'm just putting together the newsletter for this week, and it's around building high performance teams and this tool belt approach that kind of extends a little bit. But one of the things, and maybe this is something we can talk about a little bit too, especially in the classroom, the first thing assignment I have my teams do is go do something together to become familiar with each other, get to know each other a little bit, because none of this can happen if you don't know each other. And when you get into the classroom, one of the things is, yeah, we throw these groups together and then we kind of leave them on their own, right? And I don't think that has changed a heck of a lot
Interesting.
since
Yeah.
you were a student those a number of years ago, right? So just in terms of, I guess, that whole idea of familiarity, how does that play a role in?
Well, I definitely think this whole notion of having a relationship with your team members is critical. Now, the world has changed, right? In the sense that there's a lot more virtual work. You can't always be in person. And I know I can attest to the fact of building a relationship, of being with someone, is very different than doing it online. But we'll just say, for the sake of this conversation, for the sake of argument, we'll say that it's in person, right? And there's something to be said about doing an escape room, let's say, just type activity. And I think people, this whole team building notion, I think, and I've been guilty of this too, saying like, oh my God, we got to go do team building. This is so boring. Oh my God, it's such a waste of time. Let's just go work. We were smart people. We can figure this out. And yeah, people are smart, and I'm sure they are, and I'm sure they could figure it out. But how hard do you want to make it on yourself? If you know that I can trust this person, or I know how they react under pressure, or I know that they get really excited really easily, or they're calm, cool, and collected. You see it with your eyes. It is a whole different ballgame, right? And personally, I think actually an escape room is a very good idea of doing a team building exercise, because it's time bound. There's a little bit of stress, excitement, thrill, and competition, right? Because you're not trying to beat a time. But in the absence of that, like just having an open conversation, spending, taking 15 minutes of a day and having a conversation is really important. But my philosophy on team building has never been about like find the best person in every category, or find the best tool. You're talking about tool belt, right? Find the perfect tool. No, it has always been like find all of the tools that can work together the best, right? And they become a well-oiled machine purely by way of being able to kind of fit together. And there's a lot of examples talking about how, I mean, this, depending on what type of leadership books you follow or people you follow, you talk about, you've heard about SEAL teams. And SEAL teams, they're never made up of like the strongest, fastest person. They're made up of the people who are willing to work the best with their team.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And I think one of the things, and was another faculty member that I think was a committee meeting on case teams or something one year, and he came in and said, or just asked, how do I put teams together? Because I seem to have this natural talent for selecting people that can at least work together. And I think, yeah, there was part of that. There was, I don't know, there's this, maybe it's some insight I was seeing into them or whatever, but I was able to pick people that could work together. But it was also a lot of hard work in terms of getting them to do that. And I think one of the big things, and I totally agree, escape rooms are incredible. I think every university should have a set of free escape rooms that I,
Agreed. They should have them
this,
on
yeah,
campus.
on campus. And your first task is, if you've got a group project, is go do the escape room, and you get marks for it. It's free marks, but I think there's a lot of really good pieces in there in terms of starting to implement this effective training around a whole bunch of different skills, and emotional intelligence is a big part of that. I guess going from that in terms of this whole idea around familiarity and relationship building, you also talked about the social awareness piece as one of the key pieces of it. And that has been hindered a lot, especially in the last few years around COVID, et cetera. And the students were getting now lost in that year or year and a half that they were homeschooled. They lost a lot of those formative years around social awareness. And just any thoughts in terms of how do we turn that around?
Well, that is a great question. That is a great question. So, I mean, social awareness is defined as, can I accurately identify people's, like, your emotions, but then also your tendencies on how you would interact with a group? That's kind of what social awareness is. So, if I'm in a group, am I feeling uncomfortable, or if am I feeling excited? And then if I'm feeling uncomfortable, what do I do? Do I kind of pull back, or do I get quiet? And then how do I interact with that group, right? And so virtual work has created a lot of barriers, right? Now it's both good and bad. There's, without a doubt, there's been significant number of positive things that have come out of that, right? But it's so easy to just turn off your camera now, right? It's so easy to multitask when you're having a virtual meeting. And it's everyone, I think, has to do their part to be able to combat that by being really present when they're having a meeting. And it might be something as simple as obviously turning on the camera. I really, really, really think that should be almost like a mandatory thing. And also, if you can have your hands above, the reason why I say hands like above here is you can see if someone's typing or moving the mouse around. You can tell with eye contact, right? Like, for instance, you can't always tell with eye contact. So during this conversation, you might have seen me look up and over. So I know for a fact that, like, when I'm thinking, I kind of look up and to the right. I do that a lot. You might think, like, what is he looking at? Right. But if you see my hands, you see, like, a lot of the body language that I have is important to be able to tell a lot what's going going on. I mean, there's only a small portion of a conversation that is the words, right? There's a whole component. It's like 30% are words. The rest is body language and tone. And so if you can't see me, you've lost a good 50, 60% of our communication abilities. And again, this is a cliche. It's a cliche, body language, but it's also a fact. Like it's undeniable. And we really, really need to kind of put more onus, and meaning like everyone has, like I was saying, everyone has to do their part. People have to realize this is an important thing, guys. Let's be present. Let me show you my body language so that you can get the full story. If I'm feeling kind of like, if I'm slumped over or if I'm not looking, you might learn something. You might learn I had a really bad day. My kid is sick. And so once you have that piece of information, it changes how you communicate with that person, right?
I totally agree with that. As you said, we had a conversation before we start recording, and I did a case course, an intensive case course in August. So it was a 1 week. And when I was able to control what was going on with that course as a full faculty member, it was 3 days in person, 2 days online. And part of it is because we need these online skills. And the first day when students are doing presentations, I don't talk about the content. It's about what did I see on the camera? Where did you position yourself? All of those things. Did you use your hands? Did you have some upper body movement and those things? Were you trying to at least use the little bit of the body you had to communicate a
Yes.
little? And so someone else was supposed to teach it, and because of a bunch of events, 5 days in person. And I think those students lost a huge, huge piece of the value of the course because, yeah, they got a lot of in person stuff. But you know what? They're going to do a lot of work. They're going to do presentations. They're going to do stuff virtually, and they're going to do a fair amount of that nowadays because it's part of the workforce, right? It's part of the workday. And so I think that becomes a really important piece of it in terms of, and I would say, yeah, body language is probably even more than 70%. It's probably close to 80 or 85% of how you're communicating. And I think it's huge. And eye contact, one of the things I do is I show a video, and it's an advertising the government of Canada did during COVID. And they've got this doctor talking about the value of vaccines. The big problem with it is there's a bit of a credibility thing because her eyes are looking on the notes at the bottom of the PowerPoint or whatever and reading the whole thing through. Is there a credibility piece there, right? Have they missed this whole social awareness piece of it in terms of it? And I always show that before we start to do virtual things because I tell them when I'm judging virtual competitions, yeah, I know who's reading off the PowerPoint notes on their screen and who's not. Like, and it hits a lot of that engagement piece, that emotional piece, and that energy piece that I'm looking for in terms of if those aren't there, why the heck am I actually even listening to you? And I think I've told you this when I was a student. My favorite course would be with presentations at the end of the year. If I walk out of the room, you know, you just got your F because you didn't engage me whatsoever. Right. And so what was the value that you're delivering? So I think going back on that piece of it, just thinking about this whole piece around having students build their awareness around emotional intelligence, because I think that's the other piece of it. Not only do you need to get instructors engaged, but what are your thoughts in terms of getting students really engaged in terms of this is an important skill? When you look at WEF and stuff like that, they've got the core skills for 2030 and you got things like empathy and you've got all of these things that come out of emotional intelligence in there. But I don't think students really are aware of that because I think still post-secondary education is a lot of I go to class, I take in the information, I dump it out on an exam, and then who knows what I do with it.
I mean, so obviously you need concrete, you're trying to influence or convince someone that EQ is important, right? So it's like you have to be able to explain to them why am I learning this? Other than unless they already know they want it. But like some of the very simple facts is that, and this again, this is research based, but 90% of high performers. So take a company, take their high performers, and 90% of them are high in IQ, right? So obviously there's going to be, that is a significant amount. And 60% of your job performance, this is when, like, as you enter, when you're an entry level person, you need to have emotional intelligence because it's what will separate you from everyone else who was good at the thing that you learned, right? That's a differentiator, right? So 60% though is as you're growing and raising, going up through your career, working up the ladder. When you start getting into like having to work or manage other people, 60% of it is emotional intelligence. 40% about it is what you know, right? That alone should tell you everything that you need to know about emotional intelligence. I can rattle off like 50 statistics for you, but at the end of the day, if you know that 90% of your high performers are high in EQ, I don't think there's really anything else that you need to know to convince you to do it, right?
I love that. And I think one of the things I always talk about is, I don't know, maybe 1,000 students over the years that have gone through my case team training. And when I look at them and see what they're doing in terms of their career, they've all been very successful. Some of them have taken a little bit of time to figure out what the hell they want to do,
Yep. Yeah.
right?
That's okay.
But
And that's okay.
all of them have been really successful. And then I look at people like you and a number of other students I've had that I know we've had lots of conversations as you were a student. We took a ton of my courses because that was back when I taught pretty well all the senior business management or information management
Indeed.
courses. And there's a lot of those students. And I still, as I say, we don't talk regularly, but I think we think
We've
about
stayed in
each
touch,
other.
that's for sure.
Yeah, and we stay
And
in
I
touch.
know, and you've actually had me back to talk to your classes a couple of times when I was already working. And I was sharing my experiences then, and I really do feel like a lot of what I said then still stands today. I just didn't know what it was called or what it was that I was doing back then, but I would still say the same things.
That's the piece. And one of the messages I try to get to my students in terms of, why, when you start to look at why are these students being on it, as I say, probably close to 100% are being very successful. They're doing what they want to do. They're being very successful. Their progression in their careers are amazing in most cases. You know what? They're really great human beings. And I think that's one of the pieces of this. And so, yeah, just in terms of what you said, in terms of, yeah, EQ is that important in terms of it. And I think they get a lot of that because they go through this other process that they've chosen to go through, right? And so I think that works. Even those that struggle, right? I can think of a few people that, yeah, the teams, I didn't have that magic talent of putting a really good team together and they struggle in relationships. But when I start to look at and read some of the stuff they're doing on LinkedIn, et cetera, and when I have conversations with them, yeah, they're doing absolutely amazing things. And I think some of that, some of that scraped the surface at least, which is, I guess, what I count as a little bit of a success with it. I guess the other piece of this is just thinking about, I guess, motivating students in terms of getting them to talk to their instructors, et cetera. Why aren't we doing this in the classroom? Why aren't we doing more of this type of stuff? Especially when you've got a program like we have at Haskane, where pretty well every class you got group work happening, right? Why aren't we adding this to the classroom? Why are you just sitting up there and spouting off information rather than giving me skill sets? So do you have any suggestions in terms of feeding it from the other way, in terms of getting students to demand it?
I think people need to, they don't know what they don't know, right? I'm not sure if when I was a student, I'm not sure if I would have known to ask that question, like, why are you not giving me more of this? Because I didn't know it was important. or I didn't know what I needed or what work was going to be out there. I really feel like it's kind of on the instructors to be able to know this. Almost like you have to teach the instructors why it's important. But that being said, let's be honest, like AI is out there, for instance, right? And I'm not going to say it's going to take over people's jobs, or it's not going to be as black and white as that. I think that people who are doing their jobs now, they will be replaced by people who are doing that same job but with AI. Now, if you know that that's going to be the case, how can you make yourself a different, what's your differentiator, right? What's your value proposition? And something I don't think that you can replace with AI is this communication, is this relationship building, is these foundational skills. And if we can teach students that first, then I think there'll be a massive demand for it further down in their education career. So can you teach it to them in elementary, middle school, high school? So just so you know that you mentioned I did have a workshop at a school on Monday, so a couple of days ago, and it was from elementary up to high school, and I was doing this workshop for the teachers. This was for the teachers because they need to know to teach. They are building the future of our world, and unfortunately they don't get enough credit for that, but they need to be able to have EQ themselves so they can model it for their students, so that when the students make it to post-secondary, they should be demanding why, like it should be a mandatory class that they have, not because it's important, but because they know it's important to be able to succeed in the workforce. So I mean, that's kind of answering it in a roundabout way, because in order for them to demand it, you have to teach it to them. So I think you have to teach it to them young.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with that. And I love that idea. And I think it's my philosophy. In the last number of years, I was teaching a first year course, and it was really interesting, just the different responses you got from students. There were a few that responded, I think, in the correct way. But the whole idea is they were looking for content, and I wasn't looking at the content. The content was a way to develop some of the skill sets that they need in order to be successful, to actually really learn the content down the road in their more senior courses. And but I love that piece of it. And I think, yeah, there were those students that they got this figured out. So I don't know what happened in elementary school and junior high and high school with them, but something connected with that, right?
Yeah. Like
And
let's hope that they're learning it from everywhere, from their like I think emotional intelligence transcends just work. I mean, it should be in your personal life, you as a parent, as a spouse or a partner. It should be weaved throughout there. And I can tell you, again, with experience, that there are so many advantages that I've been able to expose, right? Just purely by having a natural innate curiosity and wanting to genuinely learn and be open and take feedback.
yeah, no, I love that approach to it. So I guess maybe we'll start wrapping up here and just really talk about the idea of in terms of Ismail as a 20-year-old or those 20-year-olds today. What are the big pieces of advice you would have around them? And again, part of it is going to be emotional intelligence, but it's really an open question.
I have a lot of things that I would tell my 20-year-old self. I think the first thing that I would tell them, and I can admit to this, is that I was a very emotionally wild person, in the sense that I had difficulty regulating my emotions. And if you can learn how to regulate your emotions, and we talked about some of the skills here, if you can learn to regulate them, they will open more doors than a GPA ever will. Right. And I was lucky in that I had very early on in my career a few mentors at work who pointed this out to me and were very, very patient with me. And that is what really just skyrocketed my career, is that I was able to pick this up, this idea that I had a deficiency, and I was able to figure that out. Right off the back of that is, do not run away from feedback, right? You should be getting as much constructive feedback as possible, because it might hurt, it might sting, right? But it's also like it's rocket fuel. That feedback is rocket fuel. The more feedback you can get, you don't have to agree with everything, but wouldn't it be nice to have this list of things that other people have said about you that they think you can work on, and you cherry pick or you pick 60% of them, whatever it is. Even if you pick one of those things, you're going to be a better person. And I am a huge proponent of feedback. Just massive, because I just don't know what I don't know. I don't know, maybe I talk with my hands too much and I just didn't notice that, right? No one told me, then I would never know. I mean, I can go on and on, but I'll give you a couple other things. And you can tell I've thought about this, and mostly because sometimes I have a few regrets, although I think regretting things from the past is pointless, but I have a few, but I have a lot of lessons learned. So I have thought about this a lot. And a couple of the other ones are, stop trying to impress people who don't matter, right? You should be trying to impress no one other than your previous self. That is who you should be working on impressing. And by that I mean, did you do better this week than you did last week? Right? Are you a better person this week than you were last week? That should be your only bar, right? Self improvement, because everyone is at a different level. There's going to be people who are better than you and always will be, and there's going to be people who you are better than always. So what's the best way to improve is just an incremental gain on what you did last week. And I guess the final thing I would end with in terms of what I would tell my 20-year-old self is, stop assuming that you know everything. Stop pretending like you are the best at something. Always be a learner, a learner. Ask questions, be curious, and just when you get into a job or a situation, it doesn't even have to be work related, but whenever you're in a situation, um, just assume you have something to learn from that experience. And I assure you, you will be prized in that group of people if you are open like that.
I really like that last piece of advice in terms of curiosity. I think I've got another former student that I'm recording next week with, and he was a definite wild child, more so than even yourself, probably. But I think one of the topics I really want to talk about him is curiosity, because when I think about students that were curious about things, he pretty well tops the list. So
Perfect.
uh, I think that's a lovely thing. So I think we'll wrap up the conversation here, and thank you for having the conversation. And
Absolute pleasure.